Okay, so this morning's lesson is called He Reclined at the Table, Following with Fellowship. And it's based on two chapters from the two different books that we've been using. And so let's get into it. So what both authors are pointing out is that Jesus was a social person and that the Gospels are full of Jesus interacting with people in the community, all kinds of people. Mostly his disciples, as we know, but also there's a lot of female followers that are brought forth in the scripture, and you can think of some of their names, I'm sure. He interacted with the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the scribes. He interacted with tax collectors. He interacted with pig farmers, with women of ill repute, with Samaritans, with the Syrophoenician woman that we talked about in last week's lesson, who was a total Gentile, a Greek. And on many of those occasions where his interactions with people are described, it's around a meal. He was in the home of various people for a lot of the stories that are recounted in the Gospels. And in fact, his last meal became the template for our worship services. So Jesus dining with people is a theme that is found in a variety of places in the gospel message. So today's lesson is going to really make 3 points, I think. The first point is that Christianity is about relationships. It's a relational faith. Gatherings of believers are important, including social gatherings such as shared meals. The second point that we're going to make is the main point of Rohr's chapter 5, which is the chapter that's titled it's about reclining at the table, about Jesus reclining at the table. And the point of that chapter is primarily that those gatherings should be inclusive. The inclusiveness of the message, the inclusiveness of the gatherings, all are welcome. And then finally, the point that Lowry makes in chapter 6 is that the gatherings should be missional in nature. And that's something that we should talk about some today. So we're going to talk about all three of these topics as we go through today's lesson. So Rohr devotes an entire chapter to the subject of table fellowship. In other words, sharing meals with people. And here's how he begins that chapter. He said, Jesus didn't want his community to have a social ethic. He wanted it to be a social ethic. Their very way of relating was to be a front to the system of dominance and power. It was to name reality in a new way. They were to live in a new symbolic universe. This radical idea, given in a simple clue found throughout the Christian scriptures, one biblical scholars have overlooked until recently, Jesus' presence with others at the table. That's the inclusiveness of Jesus' table fellowship. And most of the stories where we see Jesus at the table, it's interesting to look at who he's at the table with. So here are some of the points that Rohr makes in that chapter. He says, in all cultures, sharing food is a complex interaction that symbolizes group relationships and defines group boundaries almost more than any other daily event. Getting together over a meal, you want to, sometimes somebody from scouting will say to me, I need to talk to you about something. Can we get together for a coffee? That's a kind of a common thing. We have places like Starbucks that are sort of set up just to institutionalize that type of interaction. Lots of times we'll say to a friend, hey, we ought to get together. Let's go out to dinner sometime. Or why don't you come over for dinner or come over for a snack? Let's go out and have a drink. That's really common social interaction that happens all the time in our society. And Rohr makes the point that doing that defines who you're willing to eat with, who you're willing to get together with. And sort of by definition, when you do that, it also defines who you're not willing to get together with. So he looks at Jesus.
The whole way the dating scene is structured is pretty much, we'll go out to dinner.
Right. Yep. Rohr says there's tremendous symbolism connected to food. That we eat this and don't eat that means something. You know, I'm running into that more and more these days with vegetarian kids and vegan friends. You know, and so, you know, it's a little hard for Betty to plan a Thanksgiving meal.
That means something to them. Means something to them, I guess, but what it means to me is I get more of the protein.
What we had was a big pot of mac and cheese. Mac and cheese seems to make everybody happy. I don't know why, but give them mac and cheese now.
Yeah, but it's a little worse than that because some people will be offended if you eat meat.
And some will be offended if you eat cheese because it's made from milk.
Yeah, and some people are annoyed if you don't eat meat. So, you know,
And then you have the gluten-free people.
right. Although that's more of an allergy kind of thing. You know, I don't eat peanuts, but don't read anything into that other than they make me sick. But there is symbolism connected to food, and there are some things like I can't deal with calamari. Okay, because I used to go fishing all the time, and that was the bait we used. Dad would buy frozen squid, and we'd be cutting up the frozen squid and putting it on the fish hook. You know, and I can't bring myself to eat that now. Okay, but that, that's cultural. It's all what you're used to. It's all how you're socialized.
But you don't have a problem eating the fish that took the bait.
That's true. I mean, that's true. You know, and like it's the story of someone being offered some sliced tongue to eat, and he said, "I'm not going to eat anything that came out of an animal's mouth. Buy me 2 eggs instead." So it's, there are interesting dynamics about what people will eat and what they won't eat, and it's cultural, and you can offend somebody. I was in Japan, and the Japanese hosts took us out to dinner at this pretty fancy place, and the restaurant was putting these thin slices of beef on my plate. They were delicious, and I was eating them up. And every time I ate them up, they would keep putting more on there. And I finally found out that you have to leave some or they won't stop putting it there. So we're culturally conditioned to clean our plates. The Japanese are apparently culturally conditioned to always leave something so as to not offend the host, to make them think that they didn't feed you enough. So there are these cultural traditions around food. But there's symbolism connected with food. It means something. And then he says, eating is a behavior that symbolizes feelings and relationships, mediates social status and power, expresses the boundaries of group identity. And he says, who you eat with defines who you don't eat with. So these are all interesting things to think about as we look at the scripture about what Jesus was doing in this context of the meals. So we're going to look at a familiar passage here, and I wonder who's willing to read this for us.
Now one of the Pharisees invited Jesus to have dinner with him. So he went to the Pharisee's house and reclined at the table. When a woman who had lived a sinful life in that town learned that Jesus was eating at the Pharisee's house, she brought an alabaster jar of perfume. And as she stood behind him at his feet, weeping, she began to wet his feet with her tears. Then she wiped them with her hair, kissed them, and poured perfume on them. When the Pharisee who had invited him saw this, he said to himself, if this man were a prophet, he would know who is touching him and what kind of woman she is, that she is a sinner. Jesus answered him, Simon, I have something to tell you. Tell me, teacher, he said. 2 men owed money to a certain moneylender. One owed him 500 denarii and the other 50. Neither of them had the money to pay him back, so he canceled the debts of both. Now, which of them will love him more? Simon replied, I suppose the one who had the bigger debt canceled. You have judged correctly, Jesus said.
Thank you, Roger.
So What I've always wondered about the story is, it was the woman of ill repute doing in the Pharisee's house.
Yeah, good question. So let's unpack this a little bit. Where was Jesus having the meal?
At a Pharisee house.
Okay. Now think about who Jesus was. Okay, Jesus was the son of a carpenter. You know, he was in that top tier of the lower class. If you remember when we were talking about the classes in the Jewish society before, you know, pretty far below a Pharisee. Okay, and his followers were following him because he was kind of an anti-establishment type of guy. You know, think about that. You know,
He was acknowledged as a teacher.
right, he was acknowledged as a teacher, but he was also kind of anti-establishment, if you remember his interactions with Pharisees up till this point. Okay, so here he is in the home of the Pharisee, and Rourke points out that he's eating with the cultural and religious establishment, which might have been upsetting to some people who would wonder, what's he doing going to eat with these rich people? You know, some of the more liberal kinds of progressive people in the community might have criticized him for that.
Not just as the upper crust of society criticized him for eating with the tax collector.
Exactly. So then who shows up? He's there in the Pharisee's house. Who shows up in the story? The woman who was a sinner. A woman who'd led a sinful life. And this time it's the rich and powerful who are offended. What's he doing allowing that sinful woman to touch him?
She might have been a regular.
So here we see this diversity that Jesus is willing to associate with. Okay, and that is the point that Rohr is trying to make when he analyzes this story, because he's willing to go eat with the Pharisee, he's willing to interact with this woman of ill repute, the two extreme rungs of society. And that's unusual in that day. Most people stayed within their own group. We tend to stay within our own group. But there's a message here for us. So the message is clear. All are welcome to fellowship under the reign of God. No exceptions, as Pastor Judith would have said. What's the difference between the approach Jesus took with the woman and the approach the Pharisees took with the woman?
Jesus accepted her, even though she was below him and she was a sinner. He accepted her to take her perfume, to let him touch her. And I know in the Pharisees wouldn't let anybody who was unclean touch them. And that's why they were repelled by what he did.
Mm-hmm. So they would have been unaccepting of her, right? And Jesus was, so Jesus kind of reads Simon the Pharisee's mind here, right? And answers what Simon is thinking. And he answers it with this story about this guy that's in debt. What's his point?
What do you think? If you show kindness to somebody, they're going to accept you more. They're not going to accept the Pharisees who rejected her. They're going to accept Jesus. So you get more out of, my mother used to say, you get more out of money than vinegar.
Mm-hmm.
So if you treat them better, they're going to like you better.
Yeah, I've heard that too. You can attract more flies with honey than you can with vinegar. But if you really want them, throw a dead squirrel out there. Anyhow,
Why would you want to attract flies?
yeah, exactly. Well, I think it's catch flies actually, but the point is that by rejecting the women, the Pharisees basically condemned her to that life. No chance of repentance, no chance of reconciliation for her in the way that the Pharisees interacted. in the case of Jesus, the way he interacts with her gives her the opportunity, right, of recovery and reconciliation.
See, because they don't believe what they're saying, they're hypocrites,
Right.
whereas Jesus is telling you to love everybody, and yeah, he's loving her, even though he does, you know.
Right. So that's an effective ministry to her. And the Pharisees really weren't attempting to have an effective ministry.
Well, the Pharisees needed forgiveness. The Pharisee guy needed forgiveness as much as the woman did. So, Jesus is saying, who had the bigger debt?
Yeah.
I would have it he did, but probably in the Bible they're saying she did. I don't know. But they both have a debt.
Right. They both need forgiveness.
Right. But the part of the parable that troubles me a little bit is the notion that the one with the bigger debt would love the forgiver more. Both had debts. And I don't see a differentiation by degree there.
Maybe that's taking the parable too deep. The real point of the parable is that forgiveness it's a parable about forgiveness, about the need for forgiveness, and about inclusiveness, and about everybody being able to be forgiven. So here are some notes. I felt, Betty and I we were down in DC. This is many years ago now. We were down in DC attending the Episcopal Church where I guess it might have been, no, I don't think it was at one of the baptisms, but we were down there visiting our daughter, and we went to the church that they attended. And that church was, at that time, they lived in a community called DuPont Circle. They lived in a condo down there in the DuPont Circle neighborhood of DC. And DuPont Circle is the gayborhood of Washington, DC, actually. And so this Episcopal church had a very diverse community of believers there. And they had a guest speaker the day that we were there, and he was from Central Pennsylvania. He was a retired Bishop Michael Creighton from Central Pennsylvania, who came down to give a presentation. And what he talked about struck me, particularly sitting there in that worshiping community, which was obviously very diverse. You could just tell. And his main point of his sermon was that Christianity is relational, not informational. What does that mean to you?
More intimate, a relationship. You become more intimate with that person. And informational is something that you hear, and you might agree, you might not agree. It's not something that you would be really, unless you were studying something that person is talking about. But I think it's more intimate when you're, showing somebody that you like them rather than just, hey, saying, hi, how are you? You know what I mean?
How you relate to other people, not about what you know, or claim to know.
So it's
Okay.
your relationship with God.
Yeah. So let's go back to the story we were, from the scripture. How did the Pharisees approach their religion? How do you think?
Legalistic.
And what does that mean? I mean,
To them, it was about what you know and how you act.
it was a really long list, right, of rules that they would have to follow. And that was what it was about. Sorry, John, go ahead. Say that again, please.
Who's in and who's out?
But it was based on study, the learned Pharisee who knew all the details about how far you could go from your house on the Sabbath. Okay. And
Yeah, it was exclusive. It excluded people.
it was exclusive, but I'm getting at the idea that it was informational, that it was about knowing the rules. It was about knowing and following rules. Okay. Jesus' approach is completely different from that, right? He's following his heart. It's about the way he treated that woman. Okay. And he did it in what I would say was a relational way, whereas the Pharisees were, doesn't he know that she's a sinner? That's informational. So relational, not informational.
He treated the Pharisee gently as well.
Mm-hmm. So Creighton went on to say the kingdom of God is a new form of relationship. And as members of God's kingdom, we stand beside one another with compassion. Being a Christian is about serving other people. It's not about me, and it's important to give more than you receive. He said, if that seems overwhelming, remember the call goes to everyone, and so we should both expect to give and receive support. So now we get back to this gathering of believers. Here we are.
For example, the election of the Pope, that relational, it's the relation between all the cardinals and their discussion and how they felt in their relationship with God and what inspired them to connect with God.
I don't know about that.
You were saying the God, you and I have been there, God, she has.
And in the end, it all went up in smoke.
Oh, jeez. Well, here at Supplee, we do depend on giving and receiving support to each other. Okay, and we all need the support. We all try to provide it, but we all need to receive it too. And that gets into this concept of fellowship that the lesson is really about. Because Christianity is a relational faith, believers gather and need to gather. So here's another story. Let's see how these thoughts apply to it. Who wants to read it this time?
One Sabbath, when Jesus went to eat in the house of a prominent Pharisee, he was being carefully watched. There in front of him was a man suffering from dropsy. Jesus asked the Pharisees and experts in the law, is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath or not? They remained silent. So taking hold of the man, he healed him and sent him away. Then he asked them, if one of you has a son or an ox that falls into a well on the Sabbath day, will you not immediately pull him out? And they had nothing to say.
So how does the idea of relational versus informational come to play in this one?
He's telling them, you go by your rules, your son will drown. But you go by your heart, you'll save your son, whether or not you know the rules. This is more relational.
So here's what Rohr says. He says the law at this period of Jewish history is being interpreted, and when he says it, he's saying it in the present tense, but what he means is the way the Pharisees and pretty much everybody interpreted the law at that time was almost exclusively through the book of Leviticus, particularly chapters 17 to 24, which I have to admit I did not go read, but he says that that's the law of holiness. And that interpretation is categorized by obeying the law literally, ritual observance of cult, and keeping one's group and group symbols pure. That's the Levite that would walk across the street to avoid the injured guy on the sidewalk because he wanted to keep himself pure in a ritualistic sense. And holiness at that time was thought of as a separatist purity. Keep yourself away from everyone, set yourself apart, sort of like a sequestered monastery or something. Such an emphasis, Rohr says, continually reemerges in right-wing movements in every age. Correct code, cult, and community are emphasized. Legalism, exclusivity, we're in and you're out kind of attitudes.
See that in left wing groups too. It's not just a matter of right and left. Any group that is strongly ideologically driven is going to have that kind of behavior.
Right.
Mhm. So Rohr says Jesus continually interprets the law of holiness in terms of the God who he has met, and that God is always about compassion and mercy, unlike the way the Pharisees looked at things. And then Rohr cites Kohlberg's 6 stages in human moral development and asserts that Jesus is at level 6, preaching to people at levels 2 and 3. So I went and looked up Kohlberg's 6 stages of moral development and found this chart on the internet. So I'm certainly not a expert in this kind of thing, but according to this chart, there's the pre-conventional layers of avoiding punishment. So what motivates you is kind of what this is getting at. And the lowest tier is avoiding punishment. Maybe when you're a little child, that's what makes you do what your parents say. You're afraid you'll get punished if you don't, sent to your room or something. The next tier of it is self-interest. What's going to benefit me? The next tier is a good boy attitude, and maybe that's in a certain sense getting praise from people for being, how can I give examples? Maybe the first thing a child does is he doesn't want to get disciplined by his parents, so he does what they tell him. The next thing he does is that maybe if I behave this way, they'll do something nice for me and I'll get a benefit from it. The third one is maybe they'll praise me for it. That's the good boy mentality. The next one is you start to understand rules and you just are trying to follow rules. And that might be where the Pharisees were. The third one is the social contract. And that is do unto others as you would have them do to you, sort of reasoning. And then finally, the idea of principles, just doing what's right because it's right. And people, as they mature, move up this ladder. At least that's what Kohlberg says. So Kohlberg asserts this to be stages of human development, and he even associates ages. Notice the ages there. So those first 2 levels are ages 3 to 7, typically, they're saying. And then the next 2 levels are ages 8 to 13. And I kind of see that when I deal with kids in the scout troop, because those top levels, that's where the high school kids get to. The 11-year-olds that come in are down there at that. And sometimes the 11-year-olds don't cope well with somebody who's not following the rules. Even when it's kind of unimportant. So what do you guys think of this? Have you seen this before? Does it make sense?
It kind of makes sense. I picture myself in that thing when I was young.
When you get to the top of that pyramid and it's principle, doing what's right because it's right, doing the right thing. The right thing is not always clear and it's not necessarily defined in the same way across different cultures and communities.
That's true. That's true. That's the struggle that we all have. Okay. But, I keep falling back on Stephen Covey's book, The 7 Habits of Highly Successful People. And he makes the exact, he gets at it in an from an entirely different perspective, but ultimately what he advocates is a principle-centered life. And then what Covey suggests doing, which I actually did, and I think it worked, is write yourself a mission statement. A set of goals. The mission is, here's what I want to achieve. I actually wrote it. I think I still might have it hanging on a bulletin board in the office room of our house. And I wrote it down years and years ago. And it was about being a parent, being a church member, being a scout leader, being a son, because my mom was still alive. What did I want to achieve in all of those? Covey says, analyze the roles you have in your life and then figure out what your goal is in each one of those roles and write that down. And those are your principles, and try to keep that in balance and apply your principles to those roles, and don't let any one thing overwhelm the others. And that will get you away from trying to be legalistic. But of course, when I presented the Covey stuff in the class, instead of principles, I put in the center, I put God-centered, Jesus-centered, because our principles should be based on Scripture. But it's the same idea. What's right? What's right is what we discern from studying the Bible, from these classes, from the conversations we have here. And we have to be challenged by it. That's really why we're doing this whole series, is to look at what it really means to follow Jesus. What are the examples that Jesus set? And the inclusiveness that Jesus evoked is really a key element of it. Putting love first as opposed to laws, rules, having compassion and mercy, forgiveness. Those are the things we talked about in earlier sessions, and it still applies here. Those are the principles. And if, as we progress through this pyramid, hopefully we reach that point and we're able to behave as, to try to model the behavior that Jesus set as an example for us. Any other thoughts on this idea? Okay. There are many occasions in the Bible where Jesus gathered others for a meal. In most of those cases, the gathering included what would have been thought of as unsavory guests. And that's really Rohr's point. He would go to the home of the tax collector and eat. He would go to the home of a Pharisee and eat. He would deal with a woman of ill repute at one of these meals. He'd deal with the man with dropsy at one of these meals. In all of these cases, Jesus used that experience as an opportunity to teach mercy and compassion. So Rohr concludes that when the law gets in the way of human compassion, Jesus simply disregards the law. He's found its meaning. And as he says most clearly about picking and eating grain on the Sabbath, the law is not an end in itself. It's a means to an end. The law was made for humanity. Humanity was not made for the law. And think about that, healing the man with dropsy in the story we just read, a violation of the Jewish law, but the right thing to do. Picking the grain and feeding his disciples on the Sabbath, a violation of the law, but the right thing to do.
The Ten Commandments, all the other laws were made by men.
Well, yes.
Yeah.
Yes. I mean, we take the Bible as inspired by God, but we still have to understand it, and you can certainly find plenty of things in the New Testament that you would write down and say, this is the law. A good example of that is divorce. The Bible is very clearly against divorce. So what should we do about someone who's divorced? Well, my answer is we should love them. And forgive them, and I certainly would not encourage someone to stay in a abusive relationship because the Bible says they should. But I've heard of ministers that do that. So this is all food for thought. So although Rohr's chapter focuses on table fellowship, as we noted in the very first slide, Jesus was a social person in many other ways, and he interacted with people in a whole bunch of them. So give me some examples of settings in which Jesus interacted with people.
He interacted with all his disciples.
Right. So, 12 disciples gathering, discussing. That's a group, sort of like this group, right? He went to a wedding.
Brought the wine.
Yeah, sort of.
He interacted with Zacchaeus, told him to come down and open the tree.
Yep, that's an individual interaction.
He healed.
The woman at the well.
Say that again, John.
The woman at the well.
The woman at the well, yep, another individual one. Mary and Martha, that's a couple people. Fed 5,000, that's a huge group. Walked into the synagogue and said things, so.
Interacted with the money changers at the temple.
Yep. So he would interact with people individually. He would interact with 2 or 3 people in an intimate setting like he did with Mary and Martha. He would interact with people in small gatherings like he did with his disciples. He would interact with people in large gatherings like when he fed the 5,000. And he made it clear that our relationships with other people was important and second only to our relationship with God. Remember, we're talking about fellowship today, okay, about how we interact with people. Lowry's chapter 6 is called The Gathering of Followers. Rohr's chapter was about table fellowship. Lowry's chapter is about Christian gatherings, the gathering of followers. And here's what Lowry has to say. He says, Jesus gathered followers. Sometimes he had 12 with him. 12 men along with women, Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Susanna, and many other women. Sometimes he was with his inner circle of Peter, James, and John. Sometimes the gathering was much larger, 70 or more. Paul tells us that the risen Jesus appeared to over 500 followers at one time. Jesus created church. The Greek word ecclesia that gets translated church simply means gathering. If we read gathering every time we read the word church in the New Testament, we would get a feel for what Jesus was doing and what the Spirit of Christ continues to do. The gathering of believers. That's the introduction to this chapter that's called the gathering of followers. So, are Christian gatherings important to us?
We gather every Sunday.
We gather every Sunday.
And sometimes in between.
Holidays. Bible studies. Special services.
Choir practices.
Tony is on the fellowship committee. We gather for ice cream. Okay. We gather for trunk or treats. We gather for all sorts of things. We have, so worship is one example of a way in which we gather. Study like this one is another example of a way in which we gather. Prayer. Here at Supplee, that's not such a thing, but it used to be when I was growing up, the church had a prayer meeting every Wednesday night. We would go to prayer meeting. It would be a little like what Jeannie was trying to do this morning, kind of unsuccessfully. They would, people would be inspired to stand up and pray for something. Of course, we were used to that. we were all socialized, I would say, to find it acceptable to stand up in a large group and pray. So if we had something on our minds, we'd stand up and pray for it. Not everyone would do it, but lots of people would do that. And we'd all go to, I shouldn't say we'd all, certainly the prayer meetings on Wednesday were not as well attended as the worship services on Sunday, but we did have prayer meetings every Wednesday night, and we'd have a good number of people show up for them. Charles Spurgeon had a church, and he had a group called the Boiler Room. And that was a group of people that literally went down to the boiler room of the church during the worship service and had a prayer meeting to pray for the worship service that was taking place in the sanctuary. And they did that during the service every week. So gathering for prayer is something that Christians do as well. Gathering for meals. We just had the Easter Feaster here. Gathering for fun. We have bingo nights and ice cream socials. These are all gatherings.
We have the regular meetings. We have mission meetings.
Right, session meetings, committee meetings, craft group meetings. But what is the point of gathering believers? And that is really what Lowry is getting at in his chapter. Yes, believers gather. As Rohr points out, those gatherings should be inclusive. Everyone should be welcome at the gatherings. Here are some more words from Lowry about gathering. He said, Jesus gathered followers in order to send them out. He did not create an organization for preserving a set of doctrines or principles to live by or a repository for cultural traditions. The assembly of followers that he called together was formed for the liberating experience and work of God's reign. Jesus engaged them in the work he was doing. He sent them out with authority to heal and proclaim the nearness of God's reign and call people back to God. The gospel witness makes it clear that the followers of Jesus were gathered for the sake of action in the world. So I thought that was interesting as I was reading that chapter to prepare for this lesson. Why do we gather? Why do we have a bingo night? Why do we have an ice cream social? Why do we have this study group? Why do we have worship services? Ultimately, it's really all for the purpose of sharing the light of Christ in the Maple Glen community. And if we lose sight of that, we're kind of missing the point. What do you think?
In my book, since I've been coming to this church, with, talking about people who strangers are talk about coming to Supplee. I never was like that. I was always kept inside me. Now I'm just the opposite. I think I just keep going and going. Not that big. But yeah, I think it means a lot to a person to start feeling it and you want to share it. You feel God's love, you want to share it. And you want to share with other people that you know that are good people. That's me. I don't know if anybody else.
The first answer is the 10th paradoxical. He gathered his followers together to send them out. Why don't just tell them to go out?
Well, they
gathered
needed
together to charge their batteries.
That's correct. Yeah, the gathering is important because it is how it's preparatory. He was teaching his disciples, and then after he taught them, he sent. I'm teaching a merit badge to the Scouts right now. It's the communication merit badge. The requirements for the badge are to give a speech, introduce a person, attend a public meeting and report on what you learned there. What's the other one? Give a sales pitch. Well, we spent the first 6 weeks of the class going over how to give a speech, how to give a sales pitch, how to interview someone, and then I told the kids, okay, now go prepare a speech, prepare an introduction, prepare a sales pitch. And tomorrow night, they're supposed to come back and be ready to give me a sales pitch. But we had to go over how you do that first. You can't just say, go do it. You have to teach them how to do it. So there's this, and battery charging is a good metaphor for that. So we have to prepare people before they can be sent out. But sometimes we lose track of the fact that ultimately the goal is to get the message out. Not just learn how to get the message out, or not just learn what the message is, although us learning the message is a good thing too. Any other thoughts on this?
For the message, you're not going to be able to deliver it.
Exactly. But I will ask, do we think about the part of sending people out as we have our gatherings?
You say you look people back and take them and say,
No, I mean, is the Christian, we're trying to disseminate this Christian message in Maple Glen, in the United States, in the world. That's our mission, right? But when we have an Easter feaster, are we considering that mission? Is that Easter feaster helping to do that in any way? If not, what could we do to get the gatherings we have more consistent? Well, I think I'm going to stop and go to, because I have a slide coming up that I want to use for this. So a congregation that carefully instructs people in its doctrines, gives care to the order and beauty of its worship service, prides itself in its internal fellowship, but is not engaged in the world in healing, liberation, and witness to God's governance, is not yet a gathering of Jesus Christ, for Jesus gathers in order to send out. Do you agree with that?
because woman just gathers to send them out. I mean, that's the main purpose of this. I think he gathers because of the companionship. It's more than just saying, go out and tell everybody God is good and God is love. You have to feel it. You have to be like almost one. The unit has to be, you have to feel it and show it.
I think about the very beginning of his ministry, where he says, "Fishermen, follow me, and I will make you fishers of men."
Right. Which was the very first lesson in this series, by the way. That was in fact, that slide I show on the screen as it rotates through is Jesus making that call. So the missions committee recently reviewed its missions policy and added this paragraph to the missions policy from the missions committee. It says this language is in regard to the missions or causes that are supported by our missions committee, or by our church, actually, because the mission committee recommends causes for the church to support. And it says the missionary or the cause must be in agreement with the goals of missions, following Christ's command in Matthew 28 to take the good news of Jesus Christ to make disciples of all nations and teach them to obey what Jesus Christ taught his disciples. Also, by sharing the love of Christ through acts of mercy and justice with compassion for those in need, as called for in Matthew 25. So there's this twofold goal that we want the missions we support to have. And that's been recently, well, the mission policy has morphed back and forth over the last few years. This is the latest incarnation of it, but this is what session just approved at the last meeting. Okay, this is a statement about what we look for in missions that we support.
Use your words, spread the word, and help the needy.
Yep. Those objectives that we set for the missions are in line with Lowry's words too, because we expect them to follow the Great Commission in Matthew 28 to go and make disciples of all nations, or as Lowry says, proclaim the nearness of God's reign and call people back to God. And we also expect them to hear the words of Jesus in Matthew 25, where he promised condemnation to those who fail to feed the hungry, give drink to the thirsty, invite the stranger in, clothe the needy, or feed the sick and visit the prisoners, or as Lowry said, be engaged in the world in healing and liberation. So let's look at how our own mission and vision statements align with those ideas. And Supplee has a mission and vision statement, which, by the way, pops up on the screen right before the service starts every Sunday, too. And here's what it says. It says, our mission is to worship God with joy and thanksgiving, to invite people into a relationship with God, to grow together as devoted followers of Christ, and to serve others by the power of the Holy Spirit. So if you think about that, there's both battery charging in here and being sent out in here, right? Worship God with joy and thanksgiving. That's part of charging our battery. Invite people into a relationship with God is part of spreading the word. Growing together as followers of Christ is charging our battery. Serving others by the power of healing is the Matthew 25 piece. So the invite is maybe the Matthew 28 piece. The serve is maybe the Matthew 25 piece. And in between those, the worship and grow are how we prepare ourselves to do that, all of which are important. And the vision that the church has, keep in mind what a vision is. A vision is what you wish things would be like. The mission is what you're going to try to do to have that vision happen. What we wish things would be like, the vision, is that every person feels a sense of belonging, comes to God through the love of Jesus Christ, and seeks to build God's kingdom. That's the mission and vision of Supplee. So what we should be thinking about, what I'm trying to inspire us to think about, is how do the various gatherings that we have contribute towards fulfilling this mission? And that might be something to take back to your committees. And I think everybody's committee is already on this page, but can't hurt to bring it up and say, how does what we're doing here fulfill the mission of the church? Which one of these aspects is it contributing to? And maybe there are ways where we could improve what we're doing to make it do this even more. So gatherings at Supplee should be geared toward accomplishing our mission in one or both of these two ways, either with an inward focus to strengthen our members spiritually and prepare them to help us fulfill our mission, or with an outward focus to share the good news of Christ and offer help to people in need. This class has the inward focus. I'm hoping that through this class, we're strengthening the class members spiritually and preparing the class members to help fulfill the mission. I think that's what the worship services are for also. Some of the work of the committees is where the outward focus comes from. And certainly the missions committee has pretty much an exclusively outward focus. The other committees are sort of mixed. But take back to your committees, I'm encouraging you to take back to your committees, how is the work of our committee, the work of our group, fulfilling the mission of Supplee? And is there anything we can do to make that happen more? So I'm going to throw this question out there and see what you all say. Do you think we're currently striking the right balance between in the overall ministry of Supplee Church, taking everything we do into account? Do you think we're striking the right balance between an inward focus and an outward focus?
I think we're doing a pretty good job on the outward focus through through the efforts of our mission committee and the deacons. And other organizations that, are not church committees, through the nursery school, through the scouting program, through making the facility available to various borrowers.
How about the inward focus?
And providing a place for Red Cross blood drives.
Hmm. And now we're going to be a polling place.
Finding homes for people, for the holidays. Christmas.
Yeah, I'm a little sorry to say that the session voted to stop doing that.
I missed what you said.
She was talking about room at the inn, I think, which we've done for a very long time. And the nursery school and the people that organized room at the inn came to the session meeting a couple months ago and said that they think we should stop doing it. And there was a good bit of discussion at the session meeting about that, but we did ultimately vote to stop doing it. And the reasons are there were a couple of reasons. One was that it's disruptive to the nursery school program, which frankly to me seems a little bit like the tail wagging the dog. But the other there were really three reasons. The second reason was that the people running it were frustrated by the lack of support they were getting from the congregation. So it turned out that a couple of people were carrying the whole load.
But you know what? It's like a congregation is strong.
That's true.
So it starts growing if we go out and make people feel welcome and they'll want to join, we'll have more people to help.
Yeah, that would be wonderful, but it's not.
This is the goal that, we're hoping for.
Mhm. And then the third reason is that the people who stay here dislike the facility. And I don't blame them. There were three families here. They'd been at Jarretttown Church the month before they came here. And Jarretttown takes the building that used to be the old church building on Limecombe Pike. That whole building is just given to them to use. Okay. And they're free to use they have the whole building, so they can each have their own room, and they have restrooms that they're not sharing with anybody, and nobody is saying you have to pick up all the toys off the floor before the nursery school gets here in the morning. Okay. And then they come here, and one family gets stuck in that room on cots, and that room in the wintertime is like a bake oven. It's miserable in there. I mean, right now, the heat's on in this room and I have the windows open because when I came in this morning, it was too hot in here. That room's even worse. And then another family, they put curtains up around here and they put cots behind the curtains, and the family's put in there. And the third family is put over in the old library. So those are not comfortable. It's more like being in prison than being home hosted, and apparently the other churches in the program have better accommodations for the people.
Maybe
So
we should be the first one, so this way they don't expect much. The beginning and-
So anyway, we're not doing that anymore. I was disappointed, but once I heard all the arguments, I had to vote with them. That's a little bit of a digression. I might cut that out of the online one. What's that?
I'm glad to hear that.
What, that this discussion happened?
Yeah, the discussion happened and what the decision was and why. So that next December, we'll know why.
And it's also encouraging that Family Promise has been able to open additional relationships so they have other places.
Yeah, I hope that's true. I mean, I'm not, we just said we're not going to do it. I don't know how Family Promise is handling that. But we did say we'd be happy to to provide meals, to provide transportation, when it's needed. We just can't house people. Here's another one. Do you think our outward facing ministry strikes the right balance between sharing the good news and helping those in need?
Other deacons. Deacons do.
Well, the deacons are big on help.
People come in and they down, they don't have money or food or whatever. We give them gift certificates.
That's helping people in need.
Right.
What about sharing the good news?
Oh, we tell them to come back to church. We always tell them, why don't you join our church? I mean.
Well, that's not the same thing.
I think about the missionaries that we support, and we support Bible translators. That certainly is sharing the word. But we also support agape, which is definitely helping people in need. So
Right.
I think we have a pretty good balance.
Yeah, we have asked the missions committee to strike that balance. That's why that mission statement that we read a little while ago has both Matthew 28 and Matthew 25 in it. We want missions that do both.
Well, we're having a meeting on June 4th, Agape representatives are coming here to Supplee to share their good news of what they're doing in Russia. And we're inviting other churches and youth group at Jarretown come. So we're hoping people from other churches will come and hear the good news.
There's a sign up form for that. And no one has signed up yet.
But that's new.
But
That was new this week.
that's true. And it's not until the 4th of June. There's a few weeks yet.
Do you have to sign up to come?
Well,
I
no.
know the numbers, because originally Greg said we'll do it in the parlor, but if we have too many people, we'll have to do it in the fellowship.
Yeah, we want to get us. I think he said, I think they're going to have some refreshment or something too.
Yeah.
So
Like coffee, cookies, I said, just simple refreshment. And they said they needed a projector.
that's easy.
Oh, okay.
Maybe we could get, that message and sign up instructions out through the 4 major media networks on the evening news.
We could try. It's already on the church website.
Okay.
It was already in the Sunday e-blast. So
I didn't see it in the bulletin, but we need to get
it got in too late for the bulletin. Greg filed the communication request on Thursday afternoon, and it caught me, but Pam's gone. So
Where's it?
she's in Alaska.
Oh,
I'm
let's
gonna
do that.
I think she's going all next week.
So who's doing the bulletin?
I don't know. I think I mean, I have no idea. It's not me. Okay, let's keep going. So Jesus' approach to relationships and his approach to Jewish law teaches us that Christianity is a relational faith, not an informational faith, and that we should work on relationships, not theological arcana. Social interactions with both believers and non-believers are important. The point of Rohr's chapter on table fellowship in the Christian scriptures is that we should follow Jesus' lead and work on developing relationships with all kinds of people, no exceptions. And the point of Lowry's chapter on the gathering of followers is that we don't gather for the sake of gathering. We gather to prepare ourselves for wider ministry. And with that, the lesson has ended.